Welcome to Edwardian Winter's Picture It, London, 1905. The streets are slick with frost, fog curls around gas lamps, and the air smells like coal smoke mixed with, well, more coal smoke. This was Edwardian England in winter a time when life for most people was a constant battle against the cold, and not the romantic snow falling gently on your cheeks cold. No, this was a bone-chilling, seep dash into dash your dash clothes dash, and dash make dash your dash teeth dash chatter kind of cold. The Edwardian era, running roughly from 1901 to 1910, is often remembered for its elegance, fancy hats, and the rigid social rules of the time. But forget the posh gardens and high tea for a moment. For the average person, winter was less about sipping cocoa by the fire and more about simply surviving. And surviving meant dealing with icy streets, drafty houses, coal shortages, and some of the worst public transport in human history. Let's start outside. Imagine stepping out of your front door and being immediately slapped in the face by a gust of wind that seems to sneak under every layer of your clothing. The streets were mostly unpaved, full of mud, frozen puddles, and, if you were unlucky, horse droppings that had frozen into neat little brown cubes. Slipping on the ice was basically a daily lottery. Some Edwardian Londoners even carried little spikes on their boots, tiny, primitive crampons, if you will, just so they could get to work without performing an unintentional ice skating routine. Transportation wasn't exactly the Edwardian version of smooth commuting. Trams ran on tracks that were often covered in snow or black ice. Horse-drawn carriages were common, and horses didn't exactly appreciate winter either. Slipping, sliding, and sometimes tipping over into a pile of snow was a risk. It was all very adventure meets mild chaos, with a side of frostbite. And the rich, they had their fancy carriages, thick coats, and heaters in some rooms. But even they couldn't escape the cold completely. Drafty windows, leaky roofs, and coal stoves that refused to work properly made everyone a little miserable when the mercury dropped. Yet, compared to the working class, their misery came with a thick blanket and possibly a cup of hot cocoa. Homes for ordinary families were another story entirely. Most houses were cold, damp, and drafty. Central heating was rare, and even coal stoves couldn't heat an entire house. People would huddle around a single fireplace, often with several family members sharing the same chair enough to stay warm. Bedrooms were often so cold that children slept fully dressed, wearing layers of night clothes, scarves, and sometimes even hats. One can imagine the bedroom chaos. A family of 6, all piled together like human Tetris, trying not to touch the freezing walls. Keeping warm wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Chilblains, frostbite, and hypothermia were real threats. Some Edwardians tried inventive methods, wrapping themselves in extra blankets, tucking hot water bottles into their beds, or even using heated bricks wrapped in cloth. It was part skill, part desperation, and part let's hope this actually works. Food in winter was another challenge. Without modern refrigeration, fresh food spoiled quickly. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and turnips became staples. Meat, if you could afford it, was often salted or preserved. Stews and soups were common, partly because cooking a big pot over a fire not only fed the family, but also added some extra warmth to the kitchen. And yes, sometimes the food was less than appealing. Imagine trying to chew on a meat pie that could double as a doorstop. Survival first, taste second. Clothing was crucial. Layers upon layers of wool, heavy coats, gloves, scarves, hats, and boots were standard. The poor had to make do with second-hand clothes or items patched so many times that they resembled quilts more than garments. Even with all that, the cold found its way through. Fingers, toes, noses, they all had a habit of turning numb, reminding you that winter doesn't negotiate. Kids were not spared. School meant trudging through icy streets, fingers freezing on the way, and often sitting in unheated classrooms. Playtime outside wasn't much fun either. Frozen playgrounds made running and jumping both dangerous and exhausting. But children had a knack for inventing games to stay warm: races, snowball fights, and occasionally sneaky tricks to avoid chores. Mischief was sometimes the only way to feel alive in sub-zero temperatures. Health hazards were everywhere. Flu and pneumonia peaked in winter, often with deadly consequences. Medical care was limited, and home remedies were a mix of traditional knowledge and wild guesses. A common suggestion might involve a poultice, a hot drink, and lots of layers, sometimes resulting in more comfort than cure, and sometimes not. Yet, life continued. Community mattered. Neighbors shared coal, food, and advice. People learned to band together because winter was not a time for solitary suffering, and there was still joy. Even in the cold, storytelling, music, and simple games kept spirits alive. Humble pleasures like a warm slice of bread, a candlelit evening, or even a successful journey to work without falling on your face were celebrated victories. So, welcome to Edwardian winters. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't soft, and it certainly wasn't polite, but it was life, in all its frosty, smoky, and sometimes comically frustrating glory. The struggles were real, the hardships harsh, and the creativity people used to survive was impressive. And if you ever find yourself complaining about a little cold today, just remember, Edwardians didn't have central heating, insulated boots, or online delivery services. They had grit, layers, and a sense of humor sharp enough to slice through frostbite. As we move deeper into this icy world, you'll see how everyday life, food, clothing, work, and even play was shaped by winter. The Edwardians endured, adapted, and sometimes failed spectacularly, but they kept going. And that's the story we're about to explore. One chapter of frost, coal smoke, and human determination at a time. Welcome to Edwardian winters. Picture it, London, 1905. The streets are slick with frost, fog curls around gas lamps, and the air smells like coal smoke mixed with, well, more coal smoke. This was Edwardian England in winter, a time when life for most people was a constant battle against the cold, and not the romantic snow falling gently on your cheeks cold. No, this was a bone-chilling, seep dash into dash your dash clothes dash, and dash make dash your dash teeth dash chatter kind of cold. The Edwardian era, running roughly from 1901 to 1910, is often remembered for its elegance, fancy hats, and the rigid social rules of the time. But forget the posh gardens and high tea for a moment. For the average person, winter was less about sipping cocoa by the fire and more about simply surviving. And surviving meant dealing with icy streets, drafty houses, coal shortages, and some of the worst public transport in human history. Let's start outside. Imagine stepping out of your front door and being immediately slapped in the face by a gust of wind that seems to sneak under every layer of your clothing. The streets were mostly unpaved, full of mud, frozen puddles, and, if you were unlucky, horse droppings that had frozen into neat little brown cubes. Slipping on the ice was basically a daily lottery. Some Edwardian Londoners even carried little spikes on their boots, tiny, primitive crampons, if you will, just so they could get to work without performing an unintentional ice skating routine. Transportation wasn't exactly the Edwardian version of smooth commuting. Trams ran on tracks that were often covered in snow or black ice. Horse-drawn carriages were common, and horses didn't exactly appreciate winter either. Slipping, sliding, and sometimes tipping over into a pile of snow was a risk. It was all very adventure meets mild chaos, with a side of frostbite. And the rich, they had their fancy carriages, thick coats, and heaters in some rooms. But even they couldn't escape the cold completely. Drafty windows, leaky roofs, and coal stoves that refused to work properly made everyone a little miserable when the mercury dropped. Yet, compared to the working class, their misery came with a thick blanket and possibly a cup of hot cocoa. Homes for ordinary families were another story entirely. Most houses were cold, damp, and drafty. Central heating was rare, and even coal stoves couldn't heat an entire house. People would huddle around a single fireplace, often with several family members sharing the same chair enough to stay warm. Bedrooms were often so cold that children slept fully dressed, wearing layers of night clothes, scarves, and sometimes even hats. One can imagine the bedroom chaos. A family of 6, all piled together like human Tetris, trying not to touch the freezing walls. Keeping warm wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Chilblains, frostbite, and hypothermia were real threats. Some Edwardians tried inventive methods, wrapping themselves in extra blankets, tucking hot water bottles into their beds, or even using heated bricks wrapped in cloth. It was part skill, part desperation, and part let's hope this actually works. Food in winter was another challenge. Without modern refrigeration, fresh food spoiled quickly. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and turnips became staples. Meat, if you could afford it, was often salted or preserved. Stews and soups were common, partly because cooking a big pot over a fire not only fed the family, but also added some extra warmth to the kitchen. And yes, sometimes the food was less than appealing. Imagine trying to chew on a meat pie that could double as a doorstop. Survival first, taste second. Clothing was crucial. Layers upon layers of wool, heavy coats, gloves, scarves, hats, and boots were standard. The poor had to make do with second-hand clothes or items patched so many times that they resembled quilts more than garments. Even with all that, the cold found its way through. Fingers, toes, noses, they all had a habit of turning numb, reminding you that winter doesn't negotiate. Kids were not spared. School meant trudging through icy streets, fingers freezing on the way, and often sitting in unheated classrooms. Playtime outside wasn't much fun either. Frozen playgrounds made running and jumping both dangerous and exhausting. But children had a knack for inventing games to stay warm, races, snowball fights, and occasionally sneaky tricks to avoid chores. Mischief was sometimes the only way to feel alive in sub-zero temperatures. Health hazards were everywhere. Flu and pneumonia peaked in winter, often with deadly consequences. Medical care was limited, and home remedies were a mix of traditional knowledge and wild guesses. A common suggestion might involve a poultice, a hot drink, and lots of layers, sometimes resulting in more comfort than cure, and sometimes not. Yet, life continued. Community mattered. Neighbors shared coal, food, and advice. People learned to band together because winter was not a time for solitary suffering, and there was still joy. Even in the cold, storytelling, music, and simple games kept spirits alive. Humble pleasures like a warm slice of bread, a candlelit evening, or even a successful journey to work without falling on your face were celebrated victories. So, welcome to Edwardian winters. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't soft, and it certainly wasn't polite, but it was life, in all its frosty, smoky, and sometimes comically frustrating glory. The struggles were real, the hardships harsh, and the creativity people used to survive was impressive. And if you ever find yourself complaining about a little cold today, just remember, Edwardians didn't have central heating, insulated boots, or online delivery services. They had grit, layers, and a sense of humor sharp enough to slice through frostbite. As we move deeper into this icy world, you'll see how everyday life, food, clothing, work, and even play was shaped by winter. The Edwardians endured, adapted, and sometimes failed spectacularly, but they kept going. And that's the story we're about to explore. One chapter of frost, coal smoke, and human determination at a time. Homes were not warm after surviving the slippery, muddy chaos of Edwardian streets. Stepping inside your home sounded like relief. But in winter, not so fast. For most families, Edwardian houses were cold, drafty, and not exactly the cozy sanctuaries we imagine today. If the streets were the first battle against winter, then the home was the next, full of challenges, compromises, and the occasional desperate improvisation. Most ordinary houses had no central heating. If you wanted a warm room, you needed a fireplace or a coal stove, and even then, warmth rarely spread evenly. One room might be bearable, while the rest of the house felt like an icebox. Bedrooms, in particular, were notoriously cold. Imagine trying to sleep in a bedroom where the windows rattled with every gust of wind. The floorboards were icy underfoot, and the single blanket barely covered two people, let alone an entire family. People often dressed in multiple layers, nightcaps included, just to survive the night without turning into human popsicles. Coal was king in winter, but it wasn't easy to come by or use efficiently. Families had to budget carefully, too little coal, and the house was freezing too much, and you risked running out before the next delivery or overspending your meager wages. Even when you had coal, stoking the fire was a constant chore. Someone had to shovel it, light it, and keep it burning just right. Too little heat, and the chill crept in. Too much, and you risked a sooty disaster. It was a delicate, exhausting balance. Drafts were another enemy. Doors and windows were often poorly fitted, letting icy wine slip in, uninvited guest. People tried all sorts of methods to block drafts: thick curtains, rolled up blankets, stuffed cloths in the gaps under doors, or even newspapers pressed into cracks. Ingenious, yes, but sometimes laughably ineffective. One gust could send a shiver racing through the room, proving that winter had the upper hand at least for a little while. The kitchen was often the heart of the house in winter, but not because it was warm or pleasant. Cooking a big pot of stew over a coal stove or fireplace helped feed the family, and the heat radiating from the stove made the room slightly bearable. But kitchens were often crowded, smoky, and full of the smells of boiling cabbage, potatoes, and mystery meats. Yet, for families, it was a central gathering place. People huddled around, sharing stories, planning the day, and sometimes just enjoying the illusion of warmth. Bedrooms presented their own set of challenges. Beds were usually wooden frames with thin mattresses and heavy blankets. The warmth of a body could help, but for large families crammed into small rooms, it wasn't always enough. Siblings huddled together, parents shared chairs near the fireplace, and everyone hoped that one blanket could stretch far enough. Hot water bottles were a luxury, and in many homes, the closest substitute might be a brick wrapped in cloth and heated by the fire. Ingenious, but not exactly luxurious. Bathrooms, if you could call them that, were freezing cold. Many homes had no running water indoors. People carried water from a well or pump, which meant filling buckets, heating it on the stove, and then trying not to spill it in the cold kitchen or hallway. Washing up in winter was an ordeal. Baths were rare, and sponge baths in cold water became a standard. Hygiene, comfort, and warmth were constantly in tension, and winter rarely let anyone win. Some families tried creative ways to stay warm. People would gather in one room and close doors to conserve heat, essentially turning part of the house into a warm zone. Children were often wrapped in extra blankets or even tucked inside adults' beds. Clothing layers became almost theatrical. Nightgowns under pajamas, socks over stockings, shawls, caps, and scarves all aimed at keeping the body functional in sub-zero temperatures. It was a daily experiment in thermal engineering, usually improvised and sometimes laughable, but it worked well enough to survive. Furniture didn't help much. Chairs, tables, and beds were made of wood, which felt like ice in the winter. Floors were similarly unwelcoming, wooden planks or stone, sometimes covered with a thin rug, sometimes not. People often shuffled, tiptoed, or laid extra rugs to keep warm. Carpets were a luxury. Most working-class homes had bare floors that could chill you to the bone. And forget cozy corners. Every inch of space was a potential frost trap. Windows were a particular challenge. Glass was thin, single pane, and often cracked or loose. Wind whistled through the gaps, letting the cold in, and any attempt to block it, newspapers, cloth, or heavy curtains, was only partially effective. At night, condensation froze on the inside, leaving icy patterns that looked pretty, that didn't exactly make the room warmer. Some people got creative, taping sheets of paper over the window frames, a kind of primitive insulation hack. It might look silly, but it did help a bit. Despite all this, Edwardians had small comforts. A crackling fire, a warm drink, and a lit candle could transform a freezing room into a tolerable space. People adapted routines around the cold, Chores were done near heat sources. Family gatherings were clustered in the warmest rooms, and even sleep patterns shifted to maximize body heat. Every action was a strategy in a game against winter, and humans, as always, proved resourceful. Of course, not all homes were equal. The rich had more rooms, bigger fires, and sometimes early forms of radiators or gas heaters. They still felt the cold, especially in upper rooms or drafty corridors, but it was rarely the life or death struggle faced by ordinary families. For the working class, winter was a daily negotiation. How much fuel to burn, which rooms to occupy, how to feed the family, and how to survive the night without frostbite. The lesson here is simple. Warmth was precious, not guaranteed, and never easy. Edwardian homes were places of both refuge and struggle. People improvised, shared body heat, layered clothing, and used every trick in the book to stay alive. Sometimes the solutions were clever, sometimes they were ridiculous, but they were necessary. Survival depended on ingenuity, patience, and a touch of stubbornness. So, while today we might imagine Edwardian houses as quaint, elegant, or cozy, the reality in winter was far different. They were cold, drafty, and challenging, but full of life, creativity, and human determination. Families endured, laughed, and sometimes shivered together, and in that struggle, they built routines, habits, and little victories that kept them alive. And as we move to the next chapter, we'll see how winter didn't just freeze homes, it affected what people ate, how they dressed, and how they found warmth and comfort wherever they could. Food shortages and winter rations. If you think winter only made Edwardian streets and homes miserable, wait until we talk about food. Keeping full and fed in the cold months was a challenge that required creativity, resilience, and occasionally a very strong stomach. For ordinary families, winter meant rationing, preserving, and occasionally eating things you wouldn't recognize today as food. First, let's talk storage. Without modern refrigeration, fresh food spoiled quickly, especially in drafty, cold, or damp homes. Cellars, pantries, and cupboards were the main options. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and turnips were staples because they could last a bit longer. Apples were sometimes stored in barrels of sand, and cabbage heads might be kept in cool corners. But even these foods weren't immune to frost, rodents, or mold. Families often had to inspect their stock daily, hoping that what was edible yesterday didn't turn into a slimy surprise today. Meat was a luxury for many. If you were lucky enough to afford it, it was usually salted, smoked, or pickled. Fresh meat was expensive and perishable, and in winter, it became even more scarce. For the working class, a small bit of bacon, ham, or occasionally a piece of beef might appear on the table, often stretched over several meals. Those who couldn't afford meat relied on pulses, grains, and whatever vegetables were available. Stews and soups became essential, nutritious, warming, and flexible enough to stretch a little meat across a whole family. Preserving food was an art. People salted vegetables, made pickles, or fermented cabbage into sauerkraut. Some boiled roots into mash or added them to soups. Bread was baked in small quantities, often daily, because it didn't keep long. Any attempt to store perishable food was a gamble. Too long, and it spoiled too short, and you had to make another batch in freezing conditions. Cooking itself was a source of warmth, but also a lot of work. Lighting the fire, chopping ingredients, and stirring large pots in drafty kitchens was exhausting, especially when the wind howled outside. And then there was the daily rationing game. Families had to make meals stretch. Breakfasts were simple: porridge, bread, and sometimes tea, though tea was expensive and often weak. Lunch might be cold bread, cheese, or leftover stew. Dinner was the main meal, usually a thick soup, stew, or pie designed to fill bellies and provide a bit of warmth. Leftovers were carefully preserved for the next day, reheated, and stretched as far as possible. It was less about culinary delight and more about survival. Food wasn't just about sustenance, it was a psychological challenge. 2. Imagine being a child or teen, watching the adults measure every slice of bread, every spoonful of broth, all to ensure the family didn't run out before payday. Meals were shared, often in silence, with everyone aware that winter could be long and unforgiving. And yet, families found small joys, a well-baked loaf, a hot cup of tea, or a pie that actually held together. These moments, though modest, were celebrated victories. Seasonal foods also played a role. Winter meant that fresh fruit and vegetables were scarce. Citrus fruits, like oranges and lemons, were prized for their rarity and vitamin C. A single orange might be saved for a special occasion or a sick family member. Local vegetables dominated the diet. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, cabbage. Fish, often salted or smoked, supplemented meals for coastal towns, but inland, it was less common. Everything depended on location, money, and a little luck. Street markets and shops were lifelines. People braved the cold to buy what they needed, often from carts piled high with vegetables, bread, or occasional meat. Prices could spike in winter due to transport difficulties, poor harvests, or ice-blocked roads. Families learned to bargain, buy in small quantities, and occasionally rely on neighbors for sharing or swapping supplies. Community support often determined whether a household survived the harshest months with full bellies. Children weren't exempt from the food struggles. School meals were minimal, if they existed at all. Kids often brought simple lunches, bread, a bit of cheese, or scraps from home. They adapted quickly, learning to appreciate small treats like a bit of sweet cake or a rare piece of fruit. For many, winter food scarcity was a lesson in patience, ingenuity, and appreciation for even the simplest flavors. Food shortages also inspired creativity. Housewives and cooks learned to make the most of what they had. Bones became stock, vegetable peelings turned into soups, and stale bread was repurposed into puddings or crumbs for stews. Every scrap counted, and every meal was a test of imagination. Sometimes the results were questionable, but hunger was persuasive, and families ate what they needed. Interestingly, winter diets could affect mood and energy. A lack of fresh produce meant fewer vitamins, which sometimes left people tired or prone to illness. Yet, people adapted, relying on preserved foods, hearty stews, and occasional treats to maintain strength. Tea, when affordable, provided warmth and caffeine to get through long, cold days. The act of preparing and sharing meals also reinforced family bonds, offering comfort in an otherwise harsh environment. Holidays offered brief reprieves. Christmas, for instance, meant extra effort, special pies, meats if available, and small decorations to lift spirits. These feasts, modest as they might seem today, were moments of joy, a reminder that even in cold, food-scarce months, families could celebrate together. Humor, storytelling, and shared meals brought warmth that coal alone could not provide. So, Edwardian winter food wasn't about gourmet delights or flavor experiments. It was about survival, ingenuity, and community. Every meal was a balancing act. What could you afford? What could you preserve? And how could you feed everyone without running out before the next delivery? Families adapted, improvised, and occasionally laughed at the absurdity of their own culinary creations. In the end, food in winter was both a necessity and a source of small victories. A hot meal, a well-stretched stew, or even a single orange could transform a bleak day into something a little brighter. It was a mix of endurance, creativity, and the simple human desire to stay alive and fed. And as we move into the next chapter, we'll see how Edwardians fought the cold on their bodies, as well as in their homes and kitchens layer by layer, boot by boot, glove by glove. Clothing the cold, if Edwardian winter life taught one thing, it was that survival often came down to what you wore. Streets were icy, homes were drafty, and meals could be meager, but clothing could make or break your day. And in winter, layering wasn't just fashion, it was survival. For ordinary families, winter wardrobes were a patchwork of necessity and improvisation. Wool was king. Thick woolen coats, scarves, gloves, and socks were essential. Children might wear sweaters knitted by mothers or grandmothers, sometimes passed down through multiple siblings and patched in dozens of places. Adults layered shirts, vests, and heavy trousers, often with an extra coat or shawl over the top. The goal was simple: trap heat, block wind, and stay upright while shuffling across icy streets. Style, unfortunately, came second. Hats were a must. Bonnets, caps, and wide-brimmed hats kept heads and ears warm, and in some cases, doubled as a small personal shield against snow and sleet. Gloves were similarly essential, though they had the annoying habit of getting wet, making hands numb even faster. Some people carried spare pairs, but for many, freezing fingers were just part of winter life. You adapted or you suffered, and most people learned to adapt quickly. Footwear was a constant challenge. Boots were thick, heavy, and often stiff, but essential for trudging through snow, mud, and icy puddles. Poorer families sometimes made do with leather shoes, patched with bits of cloth or even scrap leather. Wet feet were a constant threat. Frostbite, chilblains, and general misery awaited anyone whose boots leaked. So people learned tricks like stuffing straw inside shoes or wearing multiple pairs of socks. Not stylish, but surprisingly effective. Outerwear varied depending on wealth. The rich had access to heavy wool coats, lined capes, and furs that would make today's fashion bloggers envious. Gloves and scarves matched, and boots were sturdy yet elegant. For the working class, every extra layer was precious, but often mismatched or hand-me-downs. A coat might be patched so many times that it looked like a quilt, yet the goal was the same: warmth, and if it was ugly, well, that was a small price to pay. Underlayers were critical. Edwardians didn't have modern thermal underwear, but long johns, woolen stockings, and extra shirts helped trap heat. Layers worked like a mini insulation system, keeping body warmth close and cold air out. People learned to prioritize covering extremities, hands, feet, and ears first, chest and legs second. The cold could be sneaky, so layering became almost a science, a bit of trial, error, and improvisation each year. Children, as always, adapted creatively. They might wear oversized coats that dragged on the ground, scarves that wrapped them like mummies, and mittens tied with string to prevent losing them. Sometimes they looked ridiculous, but appearance was secondary. The goal was survival. Kids learned early how to move in these layers, how to keep gloves from getting wet, and how to navigate icy streets without toppling into the mud. It was a kind of winter education that no school could teach. Accessories mattered, too. Scarves were multifunctional: warmth, dust protection, and sometimes a makeshift face mask against wind or soot. Pocket warmers didn't exist, but people improvised with cloths heated on the stove or wrapped around hot water bottles. Every small piece of clothing contributed to a network of protection against the cold, each layer a tiny victory against frostbite. Clothing was also a social marker. Wealthier Edwardians could afford layers that were both warm and stylish, signaling status even in winter misery. The working class, meanwhile, focused purely on function, though creativity often shone through in patched gloves, hand-me-down coats, and hand-knitted scarves. Survival was the priority, but humor and ingenuity occasionally sneaked into the ensemble. There's something admirable about someone who can navigate icy streets in a quilted coat, patched boots, and a hat that has seen better decades and still smile. Laundry in winter added another challenge. Thick woolens, layered garments, and multiple pairs of socks and gloves meant constant washing, drying, and repair. Wet clothing could freeze indoors, forcing people to hang items near the fire or stove, only to find that half the garment smelled like smoke by the time it dried. That people adapted. Routine became part of life. Wash, dry, patch, repeat. It was tedious, yes, but necessary. The cold also forced unexpected creativity. Some families stuffed extra blankets into sleeves, wrapped hot water bottles in cloth to place under layers, or doubled socks. Children sometimes borrowed pieces from siblings or adults, resulting in outfits that looked hilarious but worked surprisingly well. Fashion may have been secondary to survival, but ingenuity reigned supreme. It's worth noting that winter clothing wasn't just about comfort, it saved lives. Frostbite, chilblains, and hypothermia were real threats. Layers, scarves, gloves, and thick boots weren't accessories, they were armor against the relentless cold. People learned quickly that underestimating winter could be costly, and preparation became second nature. Interestingly, clothing also played a role in mobility. Heavy coats and boots made running, climbing, or navigating icy streets more difficult. People adjusted their movements, shuffled carefully, and learned to coordinate layers to avoid accidents. Life in winter wasn't just about warmth, it was about maintaining function while burdened with all that extra gear. Every step outside required planning, balance, and patience. Yet, despite the challenges, there were moments of humor. Children tangled in scarves, adults slipping in oversized boots, gloves disappearing mysteriously. Edwardian winters were a stage for comedy. Even amidst hardship, these small moments brought laughter, if only to keep spirits from freezing along with fingers and toes. Humor, after all, was another kind of warmth. So, clothing in Edwardian winter life was more than fashion, it was survival, community, and sometimes comedy. Layers, boots, scarves, gloves, and hats formed a protective network against the cold. People improvised, patched, and reused anything that could help. Children learned quickly, adults persevered, and together, families navigated one of the harshest climates of their time. In the next chapter, we'll see how winter didn't just affect clothing, it shaped work, routines, and the daily grind itself. How do you survive a frostbitten commute, frozen factory floors, or icy markets? The answer involves grit, determination, and, of course, the clothing we just explored. Working through the freeze. If you thought Edwardian winters were hard at home or on the streets, imagine trying to work through them. For most people, jobs didn't pause because it was cold. Factories, markets, docks, and offices all demanded attendance, and winter added a layer of misery to already grueling routines. Survival wasn't just about warmth, it was about endurance, ingenuity, and sometimes a touch of stubbornness. Factories were brutal in winter. Machinery ran regardless of weather, but factory buildings rarely had insulation or heating. Workers labored in rooms where frost clung to windows, metal equipment bit cold fingers, and coal smoke mingled with the chill. Breath misted in front of faces as people bent over looms, stamping machines, or assembly lines. Every movement required extra effort. Even small tasks felt exhausting when your hands were stiff and your feet numb. Layering helped, of course, but it was impossible to stay completely warm while moving constantly. Docks presented their own challenges. Ships arrived in frozen rivers or icy harbors, and dock workers had to unload cargo in bone-chilling wind. Wooden crates, sacks of flour, and barrels of goods became awkward obstacles in slippery conditions. Horses that pulled carts often refused to cooperate in the cold, sometimes sliding or stopping entirely. Workers learned to balance quickly, communicate loudly, and improvise whenever a load threatened to topple. Survival was as much about coordination as strength. Markets were a mix of commerce and chaos in winter. Vendors wrapped themselves in layers, huddled around small fires or braziers, and shouted over the wind to sell fruit, vegetables, or fish. Buyers braved frostbite for fresh produce, stretching pennies to buy essentials. Hands froze on coin and produce alike. Scarves muffled voices, and the cold made bargaining a test of patience. Yet markets were also social hubs. Even in misery, people laughed at mishaps, a tipped-over basket of apples, a runaway goat, or a vendor's hat blown away by a gust of wind. Street cleaners, postal workers, and other outdoor laborers faced similar trials. Snow, ice, and mud made every step treacherous. Letters and parcels got wet, brooms and carts froze, and feet turned numb despite woolen socks and thick boots. These workers were a reminder that winter spared no one. Every task required adaptation, careful planning, and, often, the ability to endure discomfort without complaint. Commuting was a daily battle in itself. Trains and trams were frequently delayed or stuck, and walking through icy streets remained inevitable for many. The cold made early mornings feel brutal, noses red, breath visible, hands stiff. Workers learned shortcuts, winter-appropriate footwear, and clever ways to keep hats and scarves in place while navigating frozen puddles or slippery steps. For some, a misstep could mean injury or at least a humiliating tumble, something that made arriving late even more embarrassing. Inside offices, warmth was not guaranteed either. Clerks, shop assistants, and other indoor workers often sat near windows or in rooms heated only minimally. Fingers ached from typing or writing in cold air, and coal fires in the corner sometimes failed to reach all corners of the room. People huddled near the heat source, occasionally exchanging blankets or scarves when necessary. Winter tested patience, endurance, and sometimes your ability to remain polite while shivering uncontrollably. Despite the discomfort, Edwardians developed routines to survive the workday. People arrived early to stoke fires, layered clothing strategically, and often carried small items like cloth-wrapped bricks or hot water bottles to keep hands or feet warm. Tea breaks were sacred moments to thaw out and regain energy. Even a brief moment next to a coal stove could feel like a small miracle. Adaptation became instinctive, and workers learned tricks from each other: how to keep boots dry, how to wrap scarves to block drafts, and how to keep fingers functional long enough to perform essential tasks. Interestingly, winter work often strengthened community bonds. Workers shared coal, clothing, or small advice to survive frostbite. Teams learned to rely on each other, not just for efficiency, but for survival. A helping hand, a shared fire, or even a joke to lift spirits could mean the difference between a tolerable day and a miserable one. Humor, as always, became a survival tool. A laugh shared while slipping on ice or fumbling with frozen cargo was another kind of warmth. Children who worked or assisted in family businesses also faced hardships. Delivering newspapers, helping in shops, or assisting parents in markets meant long hours in freezing conditions. Kids learned quickly, layer properly, keep moving, and avoid standing still for too long. Small, clever solutions, extra gloves, scarves, or wrapped bricks became essential tools for survival. It was education in endurance, a lesson in resilience, and a crash course in winter life, all rolled into one. Health hazards were ever present. Cold, damp environments increased the risk of illness, from chilblains to pneumonia. Workers often pushed through discomforts, ignoring early warning signs, because missing a day could mean lost wages. Families depended on income, and survival demanded that you endure. It was not heroic in the romantic sense, it was practical, relentless, and exhausting. Yet, winter work was not entirely grim. The challenges created a sense of accomplishment: successfully unloading a slippery crate, keeping a stall organized despite freezing hands, or arriving at work without falling into a puddle were small victories. People celebrated these privately or with laughter among colleagues. Even in harsh conditions, there was pride in enduring, a subtle reminder that humans could adapt to almost anything. So, working through the Edwardian freeze meant more than showing up. It meant layered clothing, clever tricks, community support, and humor. Every day was a negotiation with cold, ice, and frost. Survival depended on planning, endurance, and learning from experience. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was life, and Edwardians managed it with as much ingenuity and perseverance as they could muster. In the next chapter, we'll focus on the youngest members of Edwardian society, the children. How did they survive school, chores, and play in bitterly cold weather? How did their resilience, mischief, and creativity help them endure winter hardships? That's where we'll find both hardship and heartwarming ingenuity. Kids and the cold children in Edwardian winters were a curious mix of resilience, mischief, and sometimes stubborn obliviousness to frostbite. While adults worried about coal, food, and keeping the house semi-livable, kids had a different challenge: surviving school, chores, and play, all while staying warm enough to turn into miniature popsicles. Let's start with school. Classrooms were often unheated, or heated only by a small fireplace that barely affected the corners of the room. Kids sat on hard wooden benches, writing with stiff fingers and noses red from cold drafts. It wasn't unusual for teachers to bring in extra coal or firewood just to keep the students alive long enough to learn something. And if a child shivered too much, that was just another reason for a stern look. Discipline didn't pause for frostbite. Lunch was another battlefield. Many children brought simple meals from home: bread, cheese, or perhaps leftovers from breakfast. Hot meals were rare, and cold hands made opening lunchboxes a challenge. Fingers slipped, wrappers tore, and food occasionally ended up on icy floors. Still, kids were inventive. Some would trade bits of bread or cheese, huddle together to share warmth, or find small, secret ways to sneak extra snacks from the kitchen. Survival sometimes required negotiation skills that rivaled adult strategy. Outside of school, children faced icy streets, snow, and frozen playgrounds. Yet, they adapted remarkably. Snowballs, sliding on ice, and climbing frosty fences became both play and informal exercise, keeping warmth in motion. Mischief was part of survival too. Kids discovered tricks like bundling in extra layers, wrapping scarves around fingers, or using snow as impromptu mittens. Their creativity wasn't just fun, it was necessity. Winter chores added another layer of challenge: fetching water from wells, helping with firewood, or assisting in kitchens required children to brave freezing conditions. Boots would fill with slush, gloves would get wet, and tasks often took longer than expected. Parents relied on them for help, but children also learned life lessons in endurance, patience, and resourcefulness. Even something as simple as carrying a bucket of water could turn into a cold, slippery adventure. Clothing for children mirrored that of adults, but often with improvisation. Hand-me-down coats, oversized boots, scarves wrapped multiple times, and layered woolens became standard. Sometimes children looked like miniature mummies, swaddled in layers from head to toe. Fashion wasn't the goal, survival was. And yet, these outfits sometimes led to funny situations: tripping over too long scarves, boots getting stuck in snow, or coach dragging in icy puddles. Every step was a small adventure. Health was always a concern. Cold fingers and toes, frostbite, and chilblains were real risks. Yet children seemed remarkably adaptable, quickly learning which layers kept them warm, how to keep moving to maintain circulation, and when to retreat indoors. Those who survived winter learned early to navigate the harsh realities of frost, snow, and icy pavements with ingenuity. Community played an important role. Neighborhood children often formed small teams when traveling to school or running errands. They shared warmth, helped each other through slippery streets, and sometimes huddled together during outdoor play. Friendship and teamwork became tools for survival as much as layers and gloves. Even small acts, like lending a scarf or sharing a hat, could make a noticeable difference. Play was not just fun, it was essential. Snowballs, sledding, and ice sliding allowed children to stay warm through constant movement. Even minor creative inventions, like snow tunnels or frozen obstacle courses, provided both amusement and exercise. Movement kept blood flowing, fingers thawed, and spirits lifted. Winter play, though often cold and muddy, was a crucial part of survival strategy for Edwardian kids. Education itself adapted to the cold. Teachers encouraged children to stay active in the classroom, shift around benches, or even perform small exercises to keep warm. When snow fell, schools often paused outdoor activities or organized snow-based games to maintain morale. Survival education wasn't just about academics, it was about life skills, endurance, adaptation, and clever improvisation. Children's diets, as we discussed in the previous chapter, also shaped winter survival. Simple, Filling meals were essential to maintain energy. Porridge for breakfast, a piece of bread for lunch, and a hearty stew for dinner provided the fuel necessary to endure long, cold days. Even small treats, like a rare piece of fruit or sweet bread, were treasured for both nutrition and morale. Humor and mischief became tools of resilience. Kids often laughed at slippery sidewalks, threw snowballs at each other and occasionally at unsuspecting adults, and invented small tricks to make winter less miserable. These playful moments weren't just entertainment, they were coping strategies. Laughter, after all, is a type of warmth that no fire can replicate. Interestingly, winter life taught children early lessons in responsibility, helping with chores, ensuring younger siblings were dressed warmly, and managing personal clothing layers required maturity. Even simple decisions, like whether to wear extra socks or wrap hands in cloth, became exercises in judgment. Edwardian winters, harsh as they were, forged resilience in young hearts and bodies. By the end of a day, children returned home exhausted, cheeks rosy from exertion and cold, clothes damp from snow and slush. Yet they had learned to navigate the streets, survive school, contribute to family tasks, and find joy in the cold. Their ingenuity, creativity, and stubbornness helped them endure what adults often struggled with. So, kids in Edwardian winters were hardy, inventive, and surprisingly adaptable. They faced cold streets, icy squalls, frozen chores, and sometimes bitter hunger, but they found ways to thrive, play, and survive. Childhood, in winter, was as much about learning endurance and cleverness as it was about learning reading and arithmetic. Next, we'll explore the health hazards that came with the cold, from chilblains and frostbite to illnesses that thrived in drafty homes and crowded streets. How did Edwardians survive when the cold attacked not just their comfort, but their very bodies? That's where winter became truly dangerous and sometimes deadly. Health hazards. Winter in Edwardian times wasn't just cold and uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Homes were drafty, streets were icy, clothing was patchy, and food was often scarce. These conditions created a perfect storm for health problems that could range from annoying to deadly. Survival wasn't just about warmth, it was about staying well enough to endure another day of frost, coal smoke, and long treks. One of the most common afflictions was chilblains. These nasty little sores appeared when skin, usually on fingers or toes, was exposed to cold and damp for too long. At first, the skin would tingle or turn red. Then it would swell, itch, and sometimes blister. Imagine trying to work, play, or walk to school with fingers that felt like tiny ice blocks and toes that screamed at every step. Remedies were a mix of folklore and improvisation, rubbing the affected area with snow, applying lard or oil, or keeping the body wrapped in layers. Sometimes these worked, sometimes they didn't, but enduring chilblains was just part of winter life. Frostbite was the more severe cousin. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were most vulnerable. Prolonged exposure could lead to tissue damage, and in extreme cases, amputation. Edwardians learned to watch for early warning signs: pale skin, numbness, or a burning sensation followed by stinging pain. Gloves, layered socks, hats, and scarves were their primary defense, and those who ignored the early signs quickly regretted it. The cold didn't forgive carelessness. Hypothermia, though less commonly named at the time, was another serious risk. If body temperature dropped to low, people became disoriented, lethargic, and in severe cases, could die. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable. For working adults and schoolchildren, survival depended on layering clothing, keeping moving, and finding warmth whenever possible. Fires, hot drinks, and the occasional shared blanket were lifesavers. Winter was relentless, and being caught unprepared could be fatal. Cold, damp homes contributed to respiratory illnesses. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza thrived in poorly heated, drafty buildings. Coughing, fever, and fatigue became seasonal companions for many families. Medical care was limited, and home remedies ranged from herbal teas to poultices. Sometimes the treatments were effective, sometimes they were placebo at best. Families learned quickly that prevention, keeping warm, staying dry, and layering clothing was often the best medicine. Nutrition, or the lack of it, amplified health risks. With limited fresh produce and scarce meat, vitamin deficiencies were common. A lack of vitamin C, for example, could lead to scurvy, while poor nutrition overall made people more susceptible to infections. Hearty stews, preserved vegetables, and whatever small treats were available helped, but winter diets were rarely sufficient for optimal health. Survival often depended on ingenuity and stretching every meal to keep bodies functional. Children faced unique challenges. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster, making them vulnerable to frostbite and hypothermia. Crowded classrooms and playgrounds spread illness quickly, and limited food sometimes left them weak. Yet, children were remarkably adaptable. They learned layering, improvised games to stay warm, and discovered small survival tricks. Even in the harshest conditions, kids found ways to endure, sometimes through cleverness, sometimes sheer stubbornness. Elderly family members were also at risk. Reduced mobility, slower circulation, and pre-existing health conditions made frostbite, pneumonia, and other illnesses more dangerous. Families often gathered around fires, shared blankets, and prioritized warmth for the most vulnerable. Survival in Edwardian winters depended on cooperation and attention to those who could not easily fend for themselves. Work environments added their own hazards. Factories, docks, and markets exposed workers to cold drafts, wet conditions, and sometimes freezing machinery. Fingers and toes froze, colds worsened, and persistent exposure to cold increased the likelihood of chronic illness. Protective clothing and clever layering were crucial, but even then, accidents and ailments were common. Being strong, careful, and resilient was not optional, it was essential. Medical care itself was limited. Hospitals existed, but treatment options were rudimentary. Doctors relied on observation, basic remedies, and home care instructions. Families often treated minor illnesses themselves, using knowledge passed down from previous generations. While some remedies worked, others were questionable at best. Surviving winter often required self-reliance and a healthy dose of ingenuity, alongside a bit of luck. Community played an important role in mitigating health hazards. Neighbors shared coal, blankets, and advice. They visited the sick, delivered food, or helped with chores. Even small gestures, offering a hot drink or extra gloves, could make the difference between survival and serious illness. In many ways, winter strengthened social bonds because vulnerability required cooperation. No one could face the season entirely alone. Humor, as always, helped. Families laughed at mishaps, a child slipping on ice and landing in snow, a dog tracking mud through the house, or someone accidentally wearing mismatched layers. Laughter didn't cure chilblains or frostbite, but it made cold and discomfort more bearable. Edwardians learned that resilience involved both practical measures and mental fortitude. Interestingly, people also learned to anticipate winter hazards. Coal supplies were stockpiled, firewood gathered, clothing repaired or layered strategically, and children trained in survival techniques from an early age. Knowledge of how to keep warm, stay nourished, and prevent illness was passed from parent to child, creating a culture of preparation. Winter was predictable, harsh, and relentless, but those who prepared had a much higher chance of surviving it intact. So, Edwardian winters were not just inconvenient, they were genuinely hazardous. Chilblains, frostbite, hypothermia, respiratory illnesses, poor nutrition, and workplace dangers all combined to make the season a test of endurance. Families adapted through clothing, diet, layering, cooperation, and humor. Children learned survival skills early, while adults managed homes, jobs, and health with ingenuity, and the community itself became a lifeline, offering both physical aid and emotional support in the face of relentless cold. In the next chapter, we'll explore winter travel, how Edwardians navigated icy streets, frozen roads, and dangerous public transport to get to work, school, or market. Travel wasn't just inconvenient, it could be perilous, and survival often depended on wit, caution, and careful planning. Travel in frost and ice winter in Edwardian times didn't just make streets slippery, it made travel a high-stakes adventure. Whether you were heading to work, school, or the market, the cold and ice turned every journey into a delicate balance of patience, skill, and sometimes luck. Surviving a trip across town required preparation, ingenuity, and an uncanny ability to avoid mud, frost, and the occasional runaway horse. Foot travel was the default for most people. Walking on icy, uneven streets required strategy. One wrong step could send you sliding into a puddle, a cart, or a pile of mud. People shuffled, waddled, or even shimmied across especially treacherous stretches, arms flailing for balance. Children became experts at penguin-like movements, while adults learned to place each foot deliberately, like a careful chess player moving pieces on a slippery board. Layered clothing, thick boots, and scarves wrapped multiple times weren't just for warmth, they were essential tools for survival. Horse-drawn carriages were another story. Horses struggled with icy roads, often skidding or refusing to move. Drivers shouted, pedestrians dodged, and the city seemed like a chaotic stage for winter calamities. A carriage horse slipping into frozen mud could send passengers, horses, and cargo tumbling, while onlookers held their breath and sometimes laughed nervously. Riding in a carriage during winter required faith, balance, and the occasional prayer that the horse knew what it was doing. Trams and early buses were a lifeline for longer journeys, but they brought their own challenges. Ice could stop them entirely, and delays were common. Commuters crowded into cold metal boxes, shivering and clutching handrails, while steam, coal smoke, and frost mingled into a uniquely unpleasant aroma. Reading a newspaper or holding on without sliding became an art form. For many, even a short ride was a test of endurance, patience, and the ability to smile through discomfort. For rural travelers, winter posed additional obstacles. Roads became muddy quagmires or frozen tracks, and carts and wagons often got stuck. People walking between villages braved frostbite, snowdrifts, and the occasional frozen river crossing. Those without sturdy boots improvised, stuffing straw into shoes or tying cloth around ankles. Journeys that might have taken an hour in summer could take 2 or more in the dead of winter. Planning was essential, and miscalculations could leave travelers stranded, cold, and frustrated. Weather forecasting wasn't what it is today. Snow, sleet, or sudden frosts often arrived unexpectedly. People had to anticipate trouble and dress accordingly. Extra layers, scarves, gloves, and handkerchiefs weren't just comforts, they were survival tools. Travelers learned to carry spare cloth or even extra shoes for emergencies. Even a short walk could become treacherous without proper preparation. Children faced unique challenges. School routes could be icy, snowy, or muddy, and yet daily attendance was expected. Kids learned to navigate slippery streets, dodge carts and horses, and huddle together for warmth. Clever tricks like wrapping extra cloth around fingers or tying boots more snugly helped them survive. Sometimes, playful moments emerged despite danger. Snowball fights, sliding on frozen puddles, and laughter while balancing precariously on icy sidewalks. Their creativity and stubbornness were essential survival tools. Markets, factories, and offices all depended on reliable travel, yet winter made timeliness a luxury. People often left early, hoping to reach their destination before ice or mud slowed them. Delays were inevitable, but being late could mean lost wages, missed meals, or scolding from teachers and bosses. Every step was a calculated effort, balancing speed with safety, warmth with endurance. Interestingly, Edwardians developed a range of clever solutions to winter travel woes. Some streets were salted or sanded, though supplies were limited. Others were patched with straw or rubble to improve footing. Pedestrians sometimes carried small sticks to test icy patches ahead, while travelers in rural areas might rely on horses or sleds to navigate deep snow. Community knowledge of safe routes, shortcuts, and hazards became invaluable, often passed down through families or shared among neighbors. Winter travel wasn't just physical, it demanded mental endurance. Constant vigilance was necessary to avoid slipping, colliding with carriages, or sinking into frozen puddles. Decisions had to be made quickly: which route was safest, how to adjust clothing, when to keep moving, and when to pause for warmth. Survival depended on observation, quick thinking, and experience. In a way, Edwardian commuters were early winter survival experts. Despite all these challenges, people adapted remarkably well. Layering clothing, carrying extra supplies, and adjusting routines became second nature. Communities supported one another. Neighbors helped guide children to school, offered a hand to someone slipping in the mud, or shared advice on which routes were safest. Humor also played a role. A slip on ice, a lost hat, or a cart gone awry became stories shared with laughter, helping people cope with the daily grind of winter travel. For the wealthy, winter travel was easier, but not without risk. Private carriages and better maintained roads reduced exposure to mud and ice, but frostbite, slips, and cold still required careful layering. Even upper-class children learned to navigate icy streets, though their challenges were less about survival and more about avoiding embarrassment or ruined boots. In short, winter travel in Edwardian times was an endurance test. Every journey required preparation, vigilance, and resilience. Foot travel, horse-drawn carriages, trams, and rural walks were all fraught with danger, delay, and discomfort. Yet people survived, adapted, and even found humor in the chaos. Lessons learned on icy streets extended beyond survival. They shaped resourcefulness, patience, and creativity, skills that would carry Edwardians through other winter hardships. Next, we'll explore entertainment and leisure during Edwardian winters. How did families and children find joy, distraction, and warmth when streets were icy, homes were cold, and work was relentless? Spoiler: creativity and humor played starring roles. Entertainment and leisure in winter surviving Edwardian winters wasn't all frostbite, frozen boots, and coal smoke. Even in the coldest months, families and children found ways to entertain themselves, share warmth, and sneak in a little fun. Leisure wasn't luxurious, it was creative, resourceful, and often a touch chaotic, but it was essential for morale. For children, play outdoors was a mix of adventure and winter survival. Snowball fights, sledding down icy streets, and sliding on frozen puddles weren't just fun, they kept bodies moving and blood flowing. Kids learned quickly how to balance on icy sidewalks, improvise sleds from scraps of wood, and turn frozen mud patches into obstacle courses. Outdoor play was physically demanding, sometimes risky, but it was vital for both warmth and sanity. And, of course, it generated endless stories and mischief. Indoor activities were equally inventive. Families gathered around the fire, knitting, mending clothes, or simply chatting to pass the hours. Card games, board games, and storytelling became staples. Stories weren't just entertainment, they reinforced family bonds, taught lessons, and occasionally let adults sneak in a bit of humor or wisdom. Children, meanwhile, often invented their own games, using scraps of paper, string, or anything at hand. Creativity thrived where resources were scarce. Music was another form of comfort. Pianos, fiddles, or even simple whistles provided melody and distraction. Singing together, whether children or adults, warmed both body and spirit. A poorly tuned piano or off-key singing didn't matter, the joy came from participation and shared laughter. Music became a tool for endurance, a way to temporarily forget the cold, and a reminder that winter, harsh as it was, could still hold moments of warmth. Books and reading played an important role, too. Literacy rates were rising during the Edwardian era, and families with access to books often treasured them. Stories transported readers to worlds far from coal smoke and drafty windows. For children, reading was an adventure, a break from chores, and a way to stay mentally active. For adults, it provided quiet companionship during long evenings, a mental escape from frozen homes and icy streets. Holidays were highlights of winter leisure. Christmas, in particular, brought decorations, small treats, and special meals that broke the monotony of everyday survival. Even families with limited means tried to create festive cheer. A homemade decoration, a shared song, or a simple gift. The holiday spirit offered psychological warmth, helping people endure the most bitter months. Humor, music, and storytelling often peaked during these times, providing a shared sense of joy and hope. Community gatherings were essential. People attended church events, small town meetings, or neighborhood socials. These gatherings were opportunities to share resources, advice, and camaraderie. Neighbors exchanged news, small gifts, or simple hospitality, hot drinks, snacks, or even a moment of warmth by a shared fire. Social connections weren't just pleasant, they were survival tools, offering emotional support in a harsh season. Winter hobbies also flourished. Needlework, embroidery, knitting, and simple woodworking were common ways to pass the time indoors. These activities served dual purposes: practical, since clothing and household items often needed repair, and entertaining, because the repetition, creativity, and eventual finished product gave a sense of accomplishment. Children often joined in, learning skills essential for later life, while staying busy and warm. Food played a role in leisure, too. Baking, preserving, and simple cooking projects were part work, part entertainment. Families experimented with what they had, stretching ingredients creatively. Children sometimes helped, measuring, stirring, or decorating. Even the smell of freshly baked bread or pies provided a psychological boost, warming homes and hearts alike. Simple pleasures were amplified by scarcity, making the act of preparing and sharing food a cherished winter activity. Humor remained a survival tool. Slips on icy streets, frozen noses, and minor household mishaps were laughed at, shared, and even turned into stories. Jokes, pranks, and playful mischief kept spirits high, reminding everyone that winter was temporary, and life could still be joyful. Humor, alongside warmth, food, and company, was a crucial ingredient in enduring the season. Interestingly, winter entertainment often fostered resourcefulness, making sleds from scrapwood, creating games from scraps of paper, or inventing musical instruments from household items encouraged ingenuity. Children and adults alike learned to adapt, innovate, and entertain themselves with minimal resources. These skills were practical and psychological, helping people survive physically and emotionally. Even in the harshest homes, warmth was found in shared activities. Families huddled by fires, played games, told stories, sang songs, and baked together. Children learned patience, creativity, and teamwork. Adults found brief escapes from cold, hunger, and work. Leisure, in Edwardian winters, wasn't optional, it was essential. It kept bodies warm, minds active, and spirits resilient. By the end of winter, families often emerged with stronger bonds, clever tricks, and a deep appreciation for small comforts. Every card game, song, and improvised snowball fight was part of a larger survival strategy. Humor, music, storytelling, and simple play weren't just distractions, they were vital tools to endure and even enjoy a season that could otherwise be relentless. Next, we'll look at how Edwardians prepared for the next winter, planning, stockpiling, and learning from experience. Survival wasn't random, it was a carefully honed system passed from parent to child, community to community. Preparing for next winter Edwardian winters didn't just happen, they were anticipated. Families, children, and communities learned to plan, prepare, and stockpile long before the first frost hit. Survival wasn't about luck, it was about foresight, organization, and sometimes a little creativity. Each family had its own system, but the goals were the same: warmth, food, and safety. Let's start with food. By autumn, households were busy gathering and storing provisions. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and turnips were harvested and stored in cool cellars. Apples were often buried in barrels of sand to prevent spoiling, and cabbages might be packed tightly to keep longer. Families made preserves, jams, and pickles, knowing fresh fruit and vegetables would soon vanish from the markets. Preparing food wasn't just about convenience, it was a strategy for survival. Meat was carefully managed. Those who could afford it preserved it through salting, smoking, or pickling. For others, weekly rations were calculated to last as long as possible. Soups and stews were planned with frugality in mind, stretching small amounts of meat or fish across multiple meals. Improvisation was key. Bones became stock, vegetable peelings found their way into soups, and leftover bread transformed into puddings or crumbs for stews. Every scrap counted. Fuel was another priority. Coal, wood, and kindling were stockpiled before the cold set in. Households calculated their needs, sometimes adding a little extra in case of severe frost or unexpected storms. Fires weren't just for comfort, they were survival tools. Running out of fuel could mean freezing homes, frozen food, and illness. Preparation meant the difference between enduring winter comfortably and struggling through it. Clothing required foresight, too. Winter layers were repaired, patched, and mended well before snow arrived. Scarves, gloves, and socks were checked for holes, and hand-me-downs were adjusted for fit. Children's clothing was often prioritized, ensuring that they could attend school, play, and run errands without suffering frostbite. Even adults patched boots and coats, meticulously worn shoes or gloves could be dangerous once the frost arrived. Community knowledge played a big role in preparation. Neighbors exchanged advice on storage, preservation, and clothing. Small-scale bartering was common. Extra coal for preserved vegetables, or a knitted scarf for a piece of firewood. Information about safe travel routes, frost-resistant crops, and efficient heating methods spread through conversation. Communities survived better when knowledge was shared. Households also reinforced their homes. Windows were sealed with cloth or paper. Doors were checked for drafts, and fireplaces were cleaned and readied. Even small adjustments, like placing rugs over cold floors or adding extra blankets to beds, helped retain warmth. People learned that a well-prepared home could withstand winter with less discomfort, illness, and stress. Children, of course, contributed to preparations. They collected kindling, helped preserve food, repaired clothing, and learned tricks for staying warm. These tasks weren't merely chores, they were life lessons. By participating, kids developed resilience, resourcefulness, and a sense of responsibility that would serve them well for the rest of the season. Interestingly, preparation wasn't just physical, it was mental. Families discussed strategies for enduring frost, long workdays, and potential illness. They anticipated shortages, planned meals, and made contingency plans. Even humor played a role, anticipating potential mishaps, teasing each other about overstuffed scarves, or joking about icy streets helped maintain morale. Mental readiness was as crucial as physical preparedness. Entertainment and leisure were considered in planning, too. Families made sure they had materials for indoor activities, games, books, musical instruments, and craft supplies. Preparing these small comforts ahead of time provided a sense of security, warmth, and psychological relief. Even during the coldest months, having something to do kept spirits alive and distracted from frostbite, icy streets, or meager rations. Winter shopping was approached strategically. Markets and shops were visited before the first snow to gather essentials, stock up on basics, and buy scarce items like tea, sugar, or spices. Families learned to anticipate price spikes, shortages, or transport delays. Careful planning and budgeting ensured that resources lasted, minimizing panic when the frost arrived. Transportation preparations were also key. Footwear was repaired, carriages were readied, and children learned safe routes to school. Families knew which streets were treacherous, which shortcuts were reliable, and how to adjust travel plans according to weather. Preparation extended beyond home. It included the wider journey to work, school, or markets. Health preparation was a priority. Houses were cleaned, fires readied, and basic remedies were stocked. Clothing and bedding were inspected for warmth, and families made sure children and elderly members were equipped to survive the cold. Prevention was critical because medical care was limited, and winter illnesses could be deadly. Resourcefulness was the common thread, whether it was food preservation, clothing repair, home insulation, or social coordination. Survival relied on practical ingenuity. Families developed systems suited to their needs, sharing knowledge when possible and learning from past winters. Over time, preparation became instinctive, a rhythm that marked the changing seasons. By the time frost arrived, a prepared household had layered clothing ready, fuel stacked, food preserved, and entertainment arranged. Children knew what to do, homes were insulated, and routines were established. Winter was still harsh, but preparation reduced discomfort, danger, and stress. Every bit of effort before the cold arrived paid off. Once the snow fell, roads froze, and temperatures plunged. In the next chapter, we'll look at how Edwardians coped with winter storms, blizzards, and sudden weather surprises. Preparation helped, but sometimes nature still demanded resilience, ingenuity, and humor to survive. Braving winter storms, even the best preparation, couldn't stop winter storms from hitting Edwardian towns and countryside. Snow, sleet, and blizzards often arrived without warning, testing the endurance, ingenuity, and patience of every family. Surviving these storms required more than preparation. It demanded quick thinking, resilience, and a sense of humor to endure the chaos. Blizzards were particularly feared. They could reduce visibility to almost nothing, turning streets and fields into frozen, white mazes. Walking became slow, treacherous work. Streets were slippery, and snowdrifts could hide obstacles or icy puddles. Horses pulling carts often refused to move, slipping or becoming stuck in deep snow. Pedestrians and children learned to shuffle carefully, huddle together, and sometimes take detours to avoid particularly dangerous areas. Survival meant paying attention, adapting to conditions, and not panicking. Home life during storms was both a blessing and a challenge. Fires became crucial, but coal could run low, stoves needed constant tending, and indoor temperatures could drop quickly in poorly insulated houses. Families learned to cluster together for warmth, layer clothing, and conserve fuel while still staying warm enough to prevent frostbite indoors. Every extra blanket, scarf, or patch of rug became a precious asset. Storms disrupted daily routines. Schools closed, markets delayed, and factory work could be slowed or halted. While closures might sound like a reprieve, they brought new challenges. Food supplies could run low, fuel might need careful rationing, and children suddenly at home had supervision and entertainment. Families adapted by reorganizing tasks, improvising indoor activities, and prioritizing survival over routine. Travel during storms was particularly perilous. Footpaths vanished under snow, carts got stuck, and icy roads became slipping hazards. Children often had to stay home, and adults learned to leave earlier, dress in extra layers, and carry essential supplies. Travel became slow, methodical, and sometimes exhausting. Improvisation, like using sticks to test icy patches or following well-trodden paths, often made the difference between a safe journey and a nasty fall. Storms also highlighted the importance of community. Neighbors checked on each other, helped dig out carts, cleared paths, or shared firewood and food. Community resilience became crucial. No one could face a blizzard entirely alone. Mutual aid, advice, and even shared humor made winter storms more manageable. Sometimes laughter helped when a cart tipped over, or someone slipped spectacularly. Humor was an essential survival tool. Children faced unique challenges and opportunities during storms. Snowdrifts could block paths, but they also became playgrounds for sledding, snow forts, and snowball skirmishes. Outdoor fun was still possible, but survival instincts remained. Kids learned to balance adventure with caution, layer effectively, and find warmth quickly when needed. Creative games in snowdrifts also strengthened resilience, ingenuity, and social bonds. Health risks increased during storms. Cold exposure could accelerate frostbite. hypothermia, or respiratory illness. Wet clothing and frozen boots amplified discomfort and danger. Families had to monitor everyone closely, ensuring children and elderly members stayed warm and dry. Quick thinking like wrapping extra cloth around extremities or redistributing blankets could prevent serious injury or illness. Storms were a reminder that even well-prepared households needed vigilance. Transportation networks, though primitive compared to today, were severely tested. Carriages and trams struggled with snow and ice. Horses often refused to move or slipped dramatically. Delays were frequent, and travel became hazardous or impossible. Rural areas suffered more because ploughing or salting was limited. Families adapted by delaying travel, seeking shelter, or walking cautiously along cleared paths. Storms revealed how dependent survival was on adaptability and preparation. Fuel and food became even more critical. Coal, wood, and kindling needed careful rationing to maintain warmth. Supplies of preserved food were often tapped earlier than planned, and improvisation was required when resources ran low. Families prioritized essentials, warmth, nutrition, and safety while postponing less urgent needs. A well-stocked home was invaluable, but even the best preparation required careful management during severe storms. Storms tested not just physical endurance, but also mental resilience. Long hours in cold, dark, and often claustrophobic conditions could lead to frustration, stress, or despair. Families relied on storytelling, music, games, and humor to maintain morale. Laughter during minor mishaps, a child slipping dramatically in snow, a cat chasing a rolling snowball, became a lifeline. Mental warmth, like physical warmth, was essential for surviving winter storms. Interestingly, Edwardians learned from each storm. Experience built instinct, which paths were safest, how to layer clothing effectively, how to conserve fuel, and how to keep spirits high during extended cold periods. Each snowstorm, blizzard, or ice-covered morning became a lesson in resilience, foresight, and adaptation. Communities and families refined survival strategies based on past winters, passing knowledge to children and neighbors alike. In the end, braving winter storms was an exercise in preparation, endurance, and ingenuity. Homes had to be insulated, fuel stockpiled, and food preserved. Clothing had to be layered, travel planned carefully, and mental resilience maintained. Families, children, and communities relied on cooperation, humor, and experience to get through each storm. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was survival, and Edwardians managed it with determination and a remarkable ability to adapt. Next, we'll explore how winter work and play combined in outdoor winter activities, markets, fairs, and social events that continued despite frost, ice, and snow. Life never fully stopped, even in the coldest months. Outdoor winter life despite frost, ice, and freezing winds. Edwardians didn't completely retreat indoors during winter. Markets, fairs, work, and social events continued outside, creating a lively, if chilly, rhythm to the season. Outdoor winter life was a mix of survival, community, and sometimes mischief, proof that even in harsh conditions, people found ways to live, work, and even enjoy themselves. Markets were hubs of activity. Vendors wrapped in layers shouted over gusts of wind, trying to sell vegetables, fish, and baked goods. Shoppers, cheeks red from cold, navigated slippery streets, clutching bundles of coins and groceries. Fingers froze, noses ran, and scarves often blew into faces, but people endured. Markets weren't just practical, they were social centers, where neighbors exchanged news, jokes, and advice on surviving winter. Even minor accidents, a tipped-over basket or a runaway cart, became stories to laugh about. Street work continued, despite freezing conditions. Children delivered newspapers or assisted parents, and laborers loaded cargo at docks or stoked factory fires. Snow, ice, and mud complicated everything, but survival demanded persistence. People developed clever techniques, carrying small sticks to test icy surfaces, layering clothing to allow mobility, and coordinating with co-workers to avoid mishaps. Outdoor labor in winter was exhausting, but it was also a testament to endurance, resourcefulness, and human determination. Winter fairs brought both business and entertainment. Towns occasionally held small fairs, festivals, or gatherings, often timed to celebrate holidays or seasonal milestones. Stalls sold hot drinks, simple treats, and handmade goods. Music, singing, and impromptu games entertained crowds. Children ran through snowdrifts, tossing snowballs or racing sleds, while adults traded, socialized, or simply watched the spectacle. Even in freezing weather, fairs were lively, colorful, and an essential part of communal winter life. Play outdoors wasn't limited to fairs or markets. Children, bundled in scarves and gloves, found ways to keep moving and entertained. Snowball fights, sliding on frozen puddles, or building snow forts became both leisure and exercise. Mischief was part of the fun, slipping on ice, sneaking snowballs at adults, or racing carts down icy lanes. Outdoor play reinforced resilience, creativity, and teamwork, and kept children warm despite bitter temperatures. Community interaction was key. Neighbors helped each other clear snow, repair damaged roofs, or guide children safely through icy streets. Shared responsibility built trust, strengthened bonds, and improved winter survival for everyone. Small acts of kindness, a shared fire, an extra scarf, or a hot drink were invaluable, making the cold more tolerable and daily life more manageable. Work outdoors often merged with social life. Dock workers, market vendors, and factory laborers exchanged stories, jokes, and advice while enduring frostbite and icy winds. Even in discomfort, camaraderie provided warmth, shared humor, clever tricks for staying dry, and practical tips for winter work became part of the culture. Humor wasn't just entertainment, it was essential for survival. Winter also shaped commerce. Goods were priced, weighed, and traded carefully, and scarcity sometimes forced negotiation. People adapted by purchasing extra supplies, sharing, or trading with neighbors. Resourcefulness became second nature, as every item from food to firewood was essential for both comfort and survival. Outdoor markets and trades were critical to maintaining both economy and morale. Interestingly, winter rituals and customs flourished outdoors. Caroling, seasonal fairs, and small religious events created structure in the long, dark months. These gatherings weren't merely tradition, they offered warmth, community, and psychological relief. Singing, storytelling, and music provided distraction from the cold, while reinforcing social bonds and shared resilience. Even brief moments outdoors contributed to overall winter survival. Weather often dictated the pace of outdoor life. Heavy snow slowed markets, delayed deliveries, and altered routines. Gusty winds made simple errands hazardous, yet people adapted. Paths were cleared, schedules adjusted, and communal knowledge shared. Resilience in outdoor winter life depended on anticipation, flexibility, and the willingness to laugh at minor mishaps. Sliding boots, tipped carts, or runaway hats were tolerated, joked about, and remembered as stories. Transportation and travel were closely linked to outdoor activities. Horse-drawn carts, early trams, and walking routes were carefully navigated, often coordinated with neighbors or guided by experience. Children learned safe shortcuts, adults planned contingencies, and communities ensured that essential goods, services, and social events could continue despite ice, snow, or blizzards. OUTDOOR winter life was a delicate balance of risk, planning, and adaptability. Ultimately, outdoor winter life in Edwardian times reflected a combination of necessity, ingenuity, and social cohesion. Work, play, and commerce continued despite harsh conditions, while communities supported one another and found joy where possible. Humor, creativity, and resourcefulness were not optional, they were essential for both survival and sanity. Even the bitterest frost could not fully suppress the rhythms of daily life, social bonds, or moments of delight. Next, we'll explore winter festivals, holidays, and celebrations, examining how Edwardians transformed the coldest months into a season of shared joy, food, and traditions. Even in frost and snow, warmth could be found in family, community, and festivities. Winter festivals and celebrations. Even in the coldest Edwardian winters, people found ways to celebrate. Festivals, holidays, and family traditions brought warmth, laughter, and a brief reprieve from frost, coal smoke, and daily hardships. These events weren't lavish by modern standards, but they were meaningful, resourceful, and often deeply communal. Christmas was the highlight of the winter season. Houses were decorated with simple handmade ornaments, evergreen branches, and candles. Families might craft paper chains, string popcorn, or fashion small figurines to adorn hearths and windows. Though electric lights were still rare, candlelight created cozy atmospheres. The glow, combined with warmth from coal fires, transformed cold homes into festive refuges. Food played a central role. Special dishes, such as roasted meats, puddings, and baked goods, marked the holiday. Families stretched meager resources creatively. Dried fruits, preserved vegetables, and leftover bread became ingredients for festive meals. Even simple treats were treasured, and children's excitement over small sweets or baked delights made preparation worthwhile. Sharing food reinforced bonds and gave everyone a tangible reward for enduring winter's hardships. Gift-giving was modest but meaningful. Small handmade items, knitted scarves, or tiny toys were exchanged. Gifts often reflected practical needs: gloves for warmth, simple clothing, or handmade toys. The act of giving and receiving reinforced community ties and nurtured generosity. Humor often accompanied gifting. Improvised presents might be comically oversized or oddly shaped, but the thought behind them carried weight. Community gatherings enhanced the festive atmosphere. Caroling, church events, and neighborhood socials brought people together. Singing, storytelling, and collective games warmed spirits and reinforced shared identity. These gatherings were vital. In a season dominated by cold, darkness, and labor, communal joy was a crucial survival tool. Laughter, music, and socialization offered warmth that coal fires alone could not provide. Children's celebrations were inventive and spirited. They played games, built snow forts, or staged small performances. Play often incorporated winter hazards cleverly, sliding on icy paths, tossing snowballs, and constructing obstacle courses. Mischief, laughter, and creativity weren't merely entertainment, they were practical survival tools, keeping children active, warm, and engaged during long, frigid days. Other holidays punctuated winter life. Boxing Day, New Year's celebrations, and religious festivals offered additional reasons for communal gatherings. Markets sometimes coincided with festivals, providing opportunities for trade, small treats, and social interaction. Even minor local festivals allowed families to break the monotony of long, cold months. These occasions reinforced routine, morale, and community cohesion. Winter games and performances were popular. Families or neighborhoods might stage small plays, puppet shows, or musical performances. These were resourceful productions, often improvised from available materials. Children and adults collaborated, learning problem-solving and teamwork in the process. The entertainment also functioned as a morale booster, allowing creativity to flourish despite limited resources. Decorations reflected resourcefulness and ingenuity. Evergreen branches, holly, paper chains, and handmade figurines were common. Scarce materials were transformed into imaginative displays. Even small embellishments created a sense of magic and cheer, enhancing psychological resilience against the harsh season. Edwardians understood that aesthetic pleasure, even simple, could make winter more bearable. Music played an essential role in festivals. Songs, carols, and impromptu instrument performances infused life into otherwise cold and quiet streets. Participation mattered more than perfection. Off-key singing or rudimentary instruments didn't diminish joy. Singing together fostered community and provided a shared emotional warmth, keeping spirits buoyant during the darkest months. Humor was central to celebrations. Icy mishaps, slippery roads, and frozen noses were often part of the fun. Children and adults laughed at each other's slips, tripped over decorations, or mismanaged sleds. Humor wasn't frivolous, it was survival. Shared laughter reinforced bonds, lightened burdens, and reminded everyone that winter's discomforts could coexist with joy. Resourcefulness extended to gifts, games, and entertainment. Simple materials were transformed into objects of delight. Paper, cloth scraps, wood, and leftover food became toys, decorations, or ingredients for festive meals. Creativity wasn't just practical, it was essential for making winter memorable. Edwardians learned to delight in small successes, clever solutions, and imaginative improvisations. In many households, storytelling became the centerpiece of celebrations. Tales of family, local legends, or imaginative adventures captivated audiences around fires. These narratives passed down cultural knowledge, entertained, and strengthened familial bonds. Humor and suspense helped everyone momentarily forget cold toes and frozen fingers, providing psychological warmth in addition to physical heat. By the end of winter celebrations, families and communities were reinforced, spirits lifted, and survival skills subtly honed. Sharing food, laughter, music, and creativity allowed people to endure cold, darkness, and scarcity more effectively. Festivals weren't mere distractions, they were essential tools for maintaining morale, cohesion, and resilience. In short, Edwardian winter festivals and celebrations transformed hardship into opportunity. Through creativity, cooperation, and humor, people found joy amidst frost and snow. Children played, adults shared stories and songs, and communities bonded over shared experiences. Even the harshest winter could be softened by warmth from fires, friendship, and festivity. Next, we'll conclude with a reflection on Edwardian winter survival, lessons learned, enduring resilience, and how humor, creativity, and community kept people alive and sometimes smiling through the coldest months. Reflections on survival after months of frost, ice, and coal smoke. Edwardians emerged from winter with more than just rosy cheeks and stories of snowball battles. They carried lessons in resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet strength that comes from enduring long, harsh months. Survival wasn't just about warmth, it was about creativity, humor, community, and a stubborn determination to keep moving, laughing, and living. Looking back, the season's challenges were numerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, frozen roads, and drafty homes constantly threatened comfort and health. Children and adults alike had to layer clothing, stockpile food, conserve fuel, and manage daily chores in conditions that would test even the hardiest modern commuter. Every day presented a small battle, keeping warm, staying fed, avoiding injury, and maintaining morale. Yet, the Edwardians adapted in remarkable ways, layering clothing, mending boots, wrapping scarves creatively, and improvising solutions for frozen water or limited fuel were everyday feats of ingenuity. Children became experts at snow navigation, outdoor play, and mini survival strategies, while adults coordinated household needs, work responsibilities, and community support. Survival was a family and community project, a shared exercise in cleverness and endurance. Community bonds were a lifeline. Neighbors helped each other clear snow, share firewood, and offer warmth to those in need. Knowledge of safe routes, proper layering, and emergency remedies spread quickly among townsfolk. Even humor and storytelling contributed to survival. Laughing at ice slips, cold mishaps, or frozen fingers created psychological warmth that was just as vital as coal fires. Edwardians understood that survival wasn't purely physical, it required mental and emotional resilience. Winter work and play blended in fascinating ways. Markets, fairs, outdoor labor, and children's games were all part of the daily rhythm. Even in frost, ice, and snow, people maintained routines while adapting to hazards. Work became an exercise in endurance, while play offered warmth, camaraderie, and joy. These activities weren't frivolous, they were survival tools that strengthened body, mind, and social connections. Nutrition remained critical. Preserving food, stretching rations, and preparing hearty meals helped maintain energy levels and health. Improvised cooking, creative recipes, and clever preservation methods were essential. Sharing food, whether at markets, fairs, or among neighbors, reinforced community bonds and ensured that even the less fortunate had a better chance at surviving the cold months. Children's experiences were especially telling. They learned resilience early, navigating icy streets, keeping warm during school, assisting with household chores, and inventing games to stay active. The skills they developed, problem-solving, creativity, adaptability, were both practical and psychological. Childhood in Edwardian winters was tough, yes, but it also nurtured resourcefulness, confidence, and social intelligence. Preparation, of course, was the secret weapon. Autumn and early winter were dedicated to stockpiling food, fuel, and clothing, repairing homes and planning routines. Anticipating storms, shortages, and travel hazards minimized risk and maximized comfort. Knowledge passed down through families and communities created a culture of winter readiness. Prepared households fared better, but even the most prepared still had to adapt to surprises. Weather was unpredictable, and storms tested even the best-laid plans. Blizzards, icy roads, and sudden frosts required quick thinking and flexibility. Travel was treacherous, work became challenging, and communities rallied to support each other. These harsh conditions reinforced the importance of shared knowledge, cooperation, and humor. Even small acts, sharing a scarf, a fire, or a joke, had enormous value. Entertainment and leisure weren't luxuries, they were essential. Music, games, storytelling, festivals, and simple indoor pastimes offered psychological warmth. Children and adults found joy in small pleasures, whether a snowball fight, a handmade decoration, or a festive meal. Humor helped cope with discomfort, mistakes, and minor mishaps. Survival relied on physical, mental, and emotional resources in equal measure. Looking back, Edwardian winter survival was a masterclass in adaptation. Creativity, resilience, cooperation, and humor were as important as coal, firewood, or warm clothing. Communities thrived when neighbors helped one another, shared resources, and preserved traditions. Children learned survival skills alongside lessons in morality, resourcefulness, and social cooperation. Life in frost and snow forged endurance, ingenuity, and subtle wisdom. Even small acts mattered. Repairing a coat, sharing food, teaching a child to navigate ice, or lending advice about preserving vegetables all contributed to survival. Individual efforts multiplied when combined with communal support. Edwardians understood that enduring winter required attention to detail, foresight, and a willingness to help one another. The harsh season demanded it and rewarded it with warmth, safety, and shared stories. And finally, humor. It might seem minor compared to coal, food, or clothing, but it was essential. Laughing at slipping on ice, frozen fingers, or even a mismanaged sled fight provided relief, perspective, and resilience. Humor transformed discomfort into a shared experience, lightened burdens, and strengthened community bonds. Winter, though harsh, became bearable, sometimes even enjoyable, thanks to laughter. So, Edwardian winter survival wasn't just about enduring frost and ice. It was a combination of preparation, ingenuity, community, and humor. Homes were kept warm, food preserved, clothing layered, and routines adjusted. Children learned resilience and creativity. Adults coordinated household and community needs, and humor softened even the coldest, darkest days. Each frostbite, each icy step, and each long night around the fire became part of a larger story of human adaptability. In the end, the Edwardians' greatest tool wasn't coal, wood, or warm clothing. It was the ability to endure, adapt, and find joy. Even in the harshest conditions, survival was practical, yes, but it was also deeply human. Laughter, community, ingenuity, and perseverance were just as vital as any material preparation. And that's the lesson Edwardian winters leave behind. Resilience is both practical and playful, harsh yet full of warmth, and life even in frost and snow finds a way to continue.